Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where finding love meant navigating a maze of religious regulations, family politics, and social hierarchies that would make modern dating apps look refreshingly simple. You're walking through the cobblestone streets of a medieval town, breathing in the scent of wood smoke. And well, let's be honest, human waste. Because sanitation wasn't exactly a priority back then. The church bells are ringing vespers, and you're watching young people steal glances at each other across the market square, their eyes meeting for just a moment before they look away, terrified that someone might notice their improper interest. You probably won't survive this dating scene, by the way. Between the arranged marriages, the religious restrictions, and the very real possibility that your potential spouse might die of plague before you even get to hold hands, medieval romance was basically a high-stakes game of emotional Russian roulette. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this community spans across time zones, all of us sharing these quiet nighttime moments together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're witnessing a world where love wasn't just complicated, it was practically illegal without proper authorization. The medieval period, roughly spanning from 500 to 1500 CE, created a dating culture so restrictive and formalized that spontaneous romance was essentially an act of rebellion. Every romantic gesture had to be filtered through layers of religious doctrine, family approval, and economic calculation. Picture yourself as a young person in 13th century England, where even making eye contact with someone of the opposite sex could be interpreted as a scandalous advance. The church taught that romantic love was a dangerous distraction from spiritual devotion, while simultaneously insisting that marriage was a holy sacrament. Talk about mixed messages. You're caught between a religion that viewed passionate love as sinful and a society that demanded you marry for practical reasons that had nothing to do with your actual feelings. The reality of medieval dating was that most people didn't date at all, at least not in any sense we'd recognize today. Instead, you participated in an elaborate system of family negotiations, financial arrangements, and social contracts that determined your romantic fate long before you ever laid eyes on your intended spouse. Historians still argue whether genuine romantic love existed in medieval society, or if it was purely a literary invention of court poets who had too much time on their hands. What made medieval dating particularly brutal was the complete lack of personal agency. You couldn't swipe left on an unsuitable match or ghost someone after a bad first date. Once the adults in your life decided you were a good match for someone, you were essentially locked into a process that would determine the rest of your existence. And speaking of the rest of your existence, medieval life expectancy meant do us part was usually a much shorter commitment than modern couples bargain for. The economic realities of medieval life meant that romance was a luxury most people literally couldn't afford. When survival was a daily struggle, and marriage was primarily an economic alliance between families, falling in love was seen as an indulgent distraction from more practical concerns. You're living in a world where a good harvest was more romantic than a bouquet of flowers, because a good harvest might actually keep you alive through the winter. You're kneeling in a dimly lit chapel, the smell of incense heavy in the air, while a stern-faced priest explains the church's extensive rules about who you can marry, when you can marry, and exactly how you're supposed to conduct yourself in romantic relationships. The Catholic Church didn't just influence medieval dating, it controlled every aspect of it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of divine authority. The Church maintained detailed calendars of when marriages could and couldn't take place. You couldn't get married during Lent, Advent, or on any of the numerous saints' days that peppered the medieval calendar. Historians estimate that medieval couples could only legally marry on about 180 days per year, making wedding planning a logistical nightmare that would make modern bridezillas weep with frustration. But the Church's control went far deeper than just scheduling. You're discovering that the Church claimed jurisdiction over all matters of the heart, declaring marriage a sacrament that required ecclesiastical oversight. This meant that your local priest wasn't just performing your wedding ceremony. He was essentially your relationship counselor, marriage therapist, and romantic advisor, all rolled into one increasingly powerful figure. The doctrine of canonical impediments created a web of restrictions that would make your head spin. You couldn't marry anyone related to you within 7 degrees of kinship, which in the tight-knit communities of medieval Europe meant that finding an eligible spouse sometimes required creating detailed family trees that went back generations. The Church also prohibited marriages between people who had served as godparents to the same child, creating spiritual relationships that were considered just as binding as blood ties. One particularly fascinating quirk of church law was the concept of affinity, which meant that if your brother died, you were forbidden from marrying his widow, because she was now considered your spiritual sister. This created all sorts of political complications when royal families tried to form alliances through marriage, leading to the bizarre spectacle of kings and queens arguing with popes about the theological implications of their romantic choices. The Church's obsession with controlling sexuality extended to regulating married couples' intimate lives with a level of detail that would make modern relationship advice columns seem prudish. You're learning about the Church's official position that married couples should only engage in physical intimacy for the purpose of procreation, and only in positions, and at times that the Church deemed spiritually appropriate. Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were off limits, as were the weeks surrounding religious holidays. Historians still argue whether ordinary medieval people actually followed these elaborate sexual regulations, or simply ignored them when convenient. The evidence suggests that while the church preached strict control, actual medieval couples found creative ways to interpret religious law in ways that allowed for more natural human behavior. The concept of clandestine marriage created one of the most interesting loopholes in the church's control system. You could technically create a valid marriage simply by exchanging vows in private, without any witnesses or official ceremony. This led to countless legal disputes when one party later claimed the marriage never happened, forcing church courts to become medieval relationship detectives trying to determine whether couples had secretly tied the knot. The church's influence on medieval dating culture extended to the very language people used to discuss love and relationships. Religious metaphors dominated romantic poetry and love letters, with lovers comparing their devotion to spiritual worship and their beloved to various saints and angels. This wasn't just poetic convention. It was the only socially acceptable way to express passionate feelings without being accused of heresy or moral corruption. You're standing in the great hall of a medieval castle, watching a 12-year-old girl meet her future husband for the first time. He's 35, missing several teeth, and smells like he hasn't bathed since the last crusade ended. This isn't a nightmare. This is just Tuesday in the medieval marriage market, where families traded daughters like particularly valuable livestock, and age was just a number that adults chose to ignore when convenient. The practice of arranging marriages for economic and political advantage turned children into unwitting chess pieces in elaborate games of family advancement. You're witnessing transactions where girls as young as 7 were formally betrothed to men old enough to be their grandfathers, all in the name of securing advantageous alliances between powerful families. Medieval law technically required both parties to consent to marriage, but this requirement was interpreted so loosely that it became essentially meaningless. A girl's consent often consisted of her father announcing her agreement on her behalf, while she stood silently beside him, having never been asked for her actual opinion. The legal age of consent was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but betrothal contracts were routinely signed when children were still in infancy. The economic calculations behind these arrangements were staggeringly complex. You're learning about dowry negotiations that could take months or even years to complete, with families haggling over property rights, inheritance laws, and financial settlements with the intensity of modern corporate mergers. A daughter wasn't just gaining a husband, she was becoming a walking business contract that would determine her family's economic future for generations. One particularly disturbing aspect of medieval marriage arrangements was the practice of sending young girls to live with their future in-laws years before the actual wedding. This was supposed to help them adapt to their new family's customs and expectations, but it often resulted in children being essentially held hostage by families who could change the terms of the marriage agreement at will. The church officially opposed marriage before the onset of puberty, but this rule was frequently ignored when the political stakes were high enough. Historians have documented cases of royal families arranging marriages for children as young as 3 years old, with elaborate ceremonies that included everything except the actual consummation, which was delayed until the bride reached what medieval society considered sexual maturity. Historians still argue whether arranged marriages produced genuine affection between spouses or created a culture of resigned acceptance masquerading as marital harmony. The surviving personal letters and diaries from medieval couples suggest a surprisingly wide range of outcomes, from passionate devotion that developed over time to bitter resentment that lasted entire lifetimes. The concept of romantic love as a basis for marriage was not just rare in medieval society, it was actively discouraged as a dangerous fantasy that could interfere with more practical considerations. You're existing in a world where falling in love with someone inappropriate could literally destroy your family's economic prospects and social standing. Medieval girls were educated from early childhood to accept their role as marriageable commodities, learning skills like household management and textile production that would make them more attractive to potential husbands. Their education focused on becoming valuable wives rather than developing their individual talents or interests, creating a generation of women who were essentially trained to be appealing strangers to men they'd never met. The psychological impact of this system on medieval children was profound, but rarely discussed in historical records. You're glimpsing a world where children grew up knowing that their emotional future would be determined by adults who prioritized political and economic considerations over their happiness or compatibility. You're seated in an elegant castle courtyard, listening to a troubadour with perfect teeth, obviously a fantasy, singing about a knight's undying devotion to a married noblewoman he can never possess. The melody is beautiful, the poetry is sophisticated, and absolutely none of it reflects the gritty reality of how medieval people actually conducted their romantic lives. Welcome to the world of courtly love, the medieval equivalent of romantic comedy movies that create impossible expectations about real relationships. Courtly love emerged in 12th century France as a literary convention that idealized passionate, usually adulterous relationships between knights and noblewomen. The key element was that this love had to remain unconsummated and eternally frustrated. Apparently, medieval poets thought that actually achieving romantic happiness was too boring to write about. You're witnessing the birth of the idea that true love requires suffering, a concept that would torture hopeless romantics for the next 8 centuries. The rules of courtly love were elaborately codified by writers like Andreas Capellanus, who created detailed instructions for conducting these idealized relationships. Knights were supposed to perform increasingly difficult tasks to prove their devotion, while ladies were expected to remain aloof and unattainable. It was like a medieval version of playing hard to get, except it was designed to last forever and never actually result in anyone getting anyone. But here's the thing about courtly love that medieval literature professors sometimes forget to mention. most actual medieval people couldn't afford to indulge in this kind of elaborate romantic theater. While nobles were supposedly engaging in sophisticated emotional games, peasants were focused on more practical concerns like not starving to death or freezing during winter. Courtly love was essentially a luxury hobby for people wealthy enough to have time for complicated feelings. The disconnect between courtly love literature and medieval reality becomes even more apparent when you consider the economic realities of noble life. The same knights who were supposedly pining away for unattainable ladies were often engaged in arranged marriages with significant financial implications. You're watching men write passionate poetry about spiritual devotion while simultaneously negotiating dowry payments for their actual wives. Historians still argue whether courtly love influenced actual medieval behavior or remained purely a literary fantasy that had no impact on how real couples conducted their relationships. The evidence suggests that while courtly love poetry was popular entertainment, most medieval people were too practical to let romantic idealism interfere with the serious business of survival and social advancement. Fascinating aspect of courtly love culture was its emphasis on female superiority and male subservience, which directly contradicted the patriarchal structure of medieval society. In courtly love poetry, women were elevated to goddess-like status and granted power over men who worshipped them from afar. This was revolutionary in theory, but meaningless in practice, since the same women being idealized in poetry had virtually no legal rights or social autonomy in their actual lives. The troubadour tradition spread throughout medieval Europe, creating a shared cultural vocabulary of romantic longing that influenced everything from architecture to fashion. You're seeing the emergence of romantic symbols and gestures that would persist for centuries. The giving of tokens, the writing of love letters, the performance of brave deeds to win a lady's favor. These became the building blocks of Western romantic culture, even though they originated as pure fantasy. Medieval audiences understood that courtly love was entertainment rather than instruction. Much like modern viewers don't expect their relationships to resemble action movies. The problem arose when later generations began treating these literary conventions as historical documentation of how medieval people actually behaved, creating persistent myths about the romantic sophistication of medieval culture. The gap between courtly love ideals and medieval reality becomes especially clear when you examine the legal and social status of medieval women. While poetry celebrated female beauty and virtue, actual medieval law treated women as property to be transferred between male relatives. The same culture that produced elaborate celebrations of feminine perfection also maintained legal systems that denied women basic human rights. You're walking through a medieval village on market day, observing how romantic courtship varies dramatically depending on which rung of the social ladder you happen to occupy. The differences are so stark that peasants and nobles might as well be living in completely different centuries, with romantic customs that reflect the brutal realities of medieval class divisions. peasant families, courtship was refreshingly practical compared to the elaborate theatrical productions favored by the nobility. You're watching young farmers and craftspeople engage in what medieval society called bundling, a courtship practice where couples would spend time together in bed, fully clothed, and often with a wooden board between them, allowing them to talk privately while maintaining the appearance of propriety. This wasn't nearly as scandalous as it sounds, since medieval peasant houses typically consisted of one room where entire families slept together anyway. Peasant courtship often revolved around seasonal work and community gatherings. Harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days provided opportunities for young people to meet and interact under the watchful eyes of their families and neighbors. You're participating in courtship rituals that were integrated into the practical rhythms of agricultural life, where proving your value as a potential spouse meant demonstrating your ability to contribute to the family's economic survival. The middle classes, merchants, craftspeople, and urban professionals developed their own distinct courtship customs that balanced practical concerns with emerging concepts of romantic choice. You're witnessing the development of what would eventually become recognizable dating behavior. Young people spending time together in public spaces, exchanging gifts, and gradually getting to know each other's personalities before committing to marriage. Merchants' children often had more freedom to choose their own spouses than either peasants or nobles, partly because their families' economic success depended more on business acumen than on maintaining traditional bloodlines. However, this freedom came with its own pressures, as young merchants were expected to make romantic choices that would enhance their family's commercial prospects. Noble courtship was the most ritualized and restrictive, involving elaborate protocols that could take years to complete. You're observing a world where every gesture, every conversation, and every public appearance was choreographed according to complex social rules that determined appropriate behavior for different ranks of nobility. A duke's daughter couldn't be courted the same way as a baron's daughter, and the specific requirements for proper courtship behavior filled entire books of etiquette. Historians still argue whether these class-based differences in courtship reflected genuine cultural distinctions, or were simply practical adaptations to different economic realities. The evidence suggests that human nature remained fairly consistent across social classes, but the expressions of romantic interest had to conform to vastly different social expectations and economic constraints. One particularly interesting aspect of medieval class-based courtship was the role of intermediaries. Noble families employed professional matchmakers and marriage brokers who specialized in navigating the complex negotiations required for aristocratic unions. Meanwhile, peasant families relied on local priests, village elders, and extended family networks to facilitate introductions and provide guidance about suitable matches. The concept of romantic love itself was interpreted differently across social classes. Nobles could afford to indulge in elaborate emotional displays and prolonged courtship periods, while peasants needed to focus on practical compatibility and immediate immediate economic benefits. You're seeing how luxury emotions, like romantic longing, were literally luxuries that required a certain level of financial security to sustain. Medieval urban environments created new opportunities for cross-class romantic encounters that challenged traditional social boundaries. You're witnessing the emergence of stories about merchants' daughters falling in love with noble knights, or aristocratic younger sons pursuing relationships with wealthy traders' families. These relationships often scandalized traditional society, but reflected the changing economic realities of medieval urban life. The church's approach to courtship also varied significantly depending on social class. Noble families could afford to petition for special dispensations and navigate complex canonical requirements, while peasant marriages were often blessed with simple ceremonies that focused more on community acceptance than theological precision. You're sitting in the parlor of a medieval matchmaker, a shrewd woman with sharp eyes who knows more about the romantic secrets and financial situations of her community than the local priest and tax collector combined. She's the medieval equivalent of a dating app algorithm, but with the added ability to spread gossip and the power to make or break romantic aspirations through strategic information management. Professional matchmakers occupied a unique position in medieval society, serving as intermediaries between families while maintaining detailed knowledge of everyone's marriageable children, financial prospects, and potentially scandalous secrets. You're witnessing a sophisticated network of information brokers who could make or break romantic prospects with a well-timed revelation about someone's dowry situation or questionable ancestry. These matchmakers didn't just facilitate introductions, they conducted extensive background investigations that would make modern private detectives jealous. You're learning about women who maintained mental databases of family histories, property holdings, genetic health patterns, and personality traits that went back several generations. They could tell you which families produced reliable husbands, which bloodlines carried tendencies toward madness, and which dowries were more impressive on paper than in actual cash value. The matchmaking process involved complex negotiations that could stretch over months or even years. You're watching skilled negotiators who understood that successful matches required balancing emotional compatibility with practical considerations like property rights, inheritance laws, and family political alliances. A good matchmaker could find creative solutions to seemingly impossible romantic puzzles, like arranging marriages that satisfied both religious requirements and economic necessities. Medieval matchmakers often specialized in specific social classes or geographic regions, developing expertise in the particular requirements and customs of their chosen market. Some focused on merchant families and understood the complexities of commercial partnerships, while others specialized in noble alliances and could navigate the intricate protocols of aristocratic courtship. The church both embraced and suspected professional matchmakers, recognizing their practical value while worrying about their potential for facilitating inappropriate relationships. You're observing women who had to balance their business interests with religious requirements, ensuring that their matches met canonical standards while still satisfying their clients' more worldly concerns. Historians still argue whether medieval matchmakers genuinely cared about their clients' happiness, or were simply business people focused on completing successful transactions. The surviving records suggest a complex mixture of both motivations, with some matchmakers developing genuine relationships with families they served over multiple generations. One fascinating aspect of medieval matchmaking was the development of specialized terminology and coded language that allowed discreet discussion of sensitive topics. Matchmakers developed euphemisms for everything from physical defects to financial difficulties, creating a sophisticated vocabulary that allowed them to communicate crucial information without causing social embarrassment or legal complications. The economic aspects of medieval matchmaking were surprisingly complex, with fees that varied depending on the social status of the families involved and the difficulty of the match. You're learning about women who commanded significant payments for their services, sometimes receiving percentages of dowries or ongoing support from families whose matches proved successful. Medieval matchmakers also served as unofficial marriage counselors and relationship advisors, helping couples navigate the early years of arranged marriages and providing guidance when romantic partnerships faced difficulties. Their role extended far beyond the initial introduction, making them long-term family advisors who maintained relationships across generations. The decline of professional matchmaking coincided with changing social attitudes toward romantic choice and individual agency. As medieval society slowly evolved toward more personal autonomy in marriage decisions, the elaborate networks of professional matchmakers gradually became less essential, though their influence on courtship customs persisted for centuries. You're standing in a medieval church, witnessing a betrothal ceremony that carries more legal weight than most modern marriages, watching two families create binding contracts that will be nearly impossible to dissolve and will affect generations of descendants. The betrothal isn't just a romantic promise, it's a legal document that creates immediate financial obligations and transfers property rights between families in ways that make modern prenuptial agreements look like casual suggestions. Medieval betrothal was considered so legally binding that breaking an engagement required formal legal proceedings similar to divorce. You're observing a system where saying, "I promise to marry you," in front of witnesses, created immediate legal obligations that included financial penalties for the party who changed their mind. The church taught that betrothal was almost as sacred as marriage itself, making engagement rings symbols of legal bondage rather than romantic devotion. The ceremony itself involved elaborate exchanges of property, documents, and symbolic objects that formalized the transfer of the bride from her father's authority to her future husband's control. You're watching rituals where rings, coins, and family heirloovers change hands according to precise protocols that determine inheritance rights, dowry obligations, and property settlements that will govern the couple's entire married life. Canon law distinguished between several different types of betrothal agreements, each carrying different legal implications and requirements for dissolution. You're learning about sponsalia de futuro, promises of future marriage, versus sponsalia de presenti, promises creating immediate marriage, distinctions that could determine whether couples were legally married before they ever shared a bed or even participated in a wedding ceremony. Medieval families often used betrothal ceremonies to formalize complex business partnerships that extended far beyond the romantic relationship between the prospective bride and groom. You're witnessing transactions where marriage agreements included detailed provisions for trade relationships, military alliances, and political support that turned romantic unions into comprehensive family merger agreements. The legal binding nature of medieval betrothal created fascinating complications when one party died before the actual wedding could take place. Surviving partners often found themselves in legal limbo, considered married for some purposes, but single for others, leading to inheritance disputes and remarriage complications that could persist for decades. Church courts maintained specialized jurisdiction over betrothal disputes, developing sophisticated legal procedures for determining whether valid engagements existed and what remedies were appropriate when agreements were broken. You're observing a legal system that treated romantic promises as seriously as property contracts, with judges who specialized in interpreting the subtle differences between various types of marriage-related commitments. Historians still argue whether the elaborate legal framework surrounding medieval betrothal reflected genuine concern for protecting vulnerable parties, or simply represented another way for powerful institutions to control individual romantic choices. The evidence suggests that while these laws sometimes protected women from abandonment, they more often served to maintain family authority over marriage decisions. One particularly complex aspect of medieval betrothal law was the concept of conditional agreements, where engagements became binding only if certain requirements were met. You're learning about contracts that included provisions requiring the bride to maintain her virginity, the groom to achieve certain economic milestones, or both families to fulfill specific political or religious obligations before the marriage could proceed. The public nature of betrothal ceremonies served multiple legal functions, creating witness testimony that could be used in future disputes, while also providing community acknowledgement of the new family relationships being created. These weren't private romantic moments. They were public legal proceedings that required careful documentation and formal record keeping. Medieval betrothal contracts often included detailed penalty clauses that specified exactly what compensation would be required if either party broke the agreement. You're witnessing a system where changing your mind about marriage could result in financial obligations that might take years to satisfy and could affect your entire family's economic prospects. You're in the midst of organizing a medieval wedding that resembles a military campaign more than a romantic celebration, coordinating between multiple families, religious authorities, and political allies, who all have competing interests in how this marriage will be conducted and what it will symbolize. Every detail, from the guest list to the menu to the seating arrangements, carries political implications that could affect family relationships for generations. Medieval wedding preparations could take months or even years to complete, requiring coordination between families who might live hundreds of miles apart and who needed to negotiate everything from the wedding date to the specific religious ceremonies that would be performed. You're managing logistics that would challenge modern event planners, all while maintaining diplomatic relationships between families who might have been enemies just a few years earlier. The guest list alone represented a complex political document that reflected family alliances, social hierarchies, and diplomatic relationships. You're creating invitations that serve as public declarations, of which families and individuals the host family considers worthy of inclusion, while carefully avoiding insults that could create lasting enemies or diplomatic incidents. Medieval weddings were designed to demonstrate family wealth and status through elaborate displays of conspicuous consumption that would be remembered and discussed for years. You're organizing events that might include multiple days of feasting, entertainment, and ceremonial activities, all designed to create lasting impressions about the family's prosperity and social connections. Religious aspects of medieval wedding planning required careful coordination with church authorities, who maintained detailed requirements about everything from the timing of ceremonies to the specific prayers that would be recited. You're navigating canonical requirements that could affect the legal validity of the marriage, while also satisfying family traditions and social expectations that might conflict with official church doctrine. Food preparation for medieval weddings represented massive logistical undertakings that required coordinating with local suppliers, managing seasonal availability of ingredients, and creating menus that would appropriately reflect family status, while accommodating the dietary restrictions and preferences of dozens or even hundreds of guests. Historians still argue whether medieval weddings actually created the family bonds and political alliances they were designed to establish, or whether they simply provided expensive theater that had little lasting impact on actual relationships between families. The evidence suggests that while wedding celebrations were certainly memorable, their political effectiveness varied significantly depending on the specific circumstances and personalities involved. One particularly complex aspect of medieval wedding planning was managing the expectations and requirements of multiple generations within each family. You're balancing the preferences of grandparents who might remember different wedding traditions, parents who are paying for the celebration, and young couples who might have their own ideas about how their wedding should be conducted. The economic implications of medieval wedding preparations could affect families for years after the actual ceremony, with some families going into debt to finance appropriately impressive celebrations. You're witnessing a social system that essentially required families to invest significant portions of their wealth in single events that would be judged by the entire community. Medieval wedding preparations also involved complex negotiations about gift-giving customs, inheritance announcements, and property transfers that would be formalized during the wedding ceremony. These weren't just celebrations. They were public legal proceedings that created lasting obligations and rights that would affect multiple generations. The entertainment aspects of medieval weddings required hiring professional performers, musicians, and sometimes even special religious figures who could provide appropriate ceremonial enhancement to the proceedings. You're coordinating with medieval wedding vendors who specialized in creating memorable experiences that would reflect positively on the family's sophistication and cultural refinement. You're witnessing one of the most invasive and disturbing aspects of medieval marriage culture: the systematic documentation and verification of wedding night activities that treated intimate moments between newlyweds as legal evidence, requiring witness testimony and physical proof. Medieval society was so obsessed with confirming that marriages had been properly consummated that they created elaborate procedures for monitoring and recording the most private moments of couples' lives. The church and civil authorities maintained that marriage wasn't fully legal until it had been consummated, creating a legal framework that essentially required couples to provide evidence of their sexual activity to confirm the validity of their union. You're observing a system where wedding nights weren't private romantic experiences, but legal procedures that might require witness testimony, physical examination, and formal documentation. Medieval law distinguished between marriages that were legally binding, but not consummated, versus marriages that achieved full legal status through physical consummation. This distinction could affect inheritance rights, property transfers, and the ability to seek annulments, making the wedding night a crucial legal milestone rather than simply a personal romantic experience. In some regions and social classes, wedding night consummation required the presence of witnesses who could later testify that the marriage had been properly fulfilled. You're learning about customs where family members, religious authorities, or legal representatives would literally listen outside the wedding chamber or examine bedding afterward for evidence of consummation. The pressure to provide proof of consummation created particularly difficult situations for couples who might be nervous, physically incompatible, or simply uncomfortable with the invasive scrutiny of their intimate relationship. Medieval records include numerous legal disputes where marriages were challenged because adequate proof of consummation couldn't be established. Royal and noble families faced especially intense scrutiny regarding consummation, since the legal validity of their marriages could affect succession rights, territorial claims, and international alliances. You're witnessing wedding nights that resembled legal proceedings more than romantic encounters, with court officials and family representatives closely monitoring every aspect of the newlyweds' activities. Historians still argue whether medieval consummation requirements reflected genuine legal necessity or represented excessive interference in couples' private lives that served primarily to maintain institutional control over marriage relationships. The evidence suggests that while these requirements had some basis in protecting women from abandonment, they more often served to satisfy institutional curiosity and authority. Medieval medical authorities developed elaborate theories about physical signs of consummation that could be used as evidence in legal proceedings. You're learning about examinations and procedures that would be considered completely inappropriate by modern standards, but were treated as routine legal requirements by medieval courts and religious authorities. The psychological impact of consummation requirements on medieval newlyweds was rarely discussed in historical records, but surviving personal accounts suggest that many couples found the pressure and scrutiny deeply traumatic and counterproductive to developing natural romantic relationships. One fascinating aspect of medieval consummation law was the development of legal remedies for situations where consummation proved impossible due to physical or psychological factors. Church courts created specialized procedures for investigating and resolving these delicate situations, often requiring testimony from multiple witnesses and expert examination by religious authorities. The concept of non-consummation as grounds for annulment created opportunities for couples to escape unwanted marriages, but only if they could navigate complex legal procedures that required intimate testimony about their private relationship. You're observing a system that simultaneously created escape routes from unhappy marriages while making those escape routes incredibly difficult and embarrassing to pursue. Medieval consummation requirements also reflected broader cultural anxieties about sexuality, legitimacy, and family honor that extended far beyond individual romantic relationships to encompass community standards and religious doctrine about appropriate sexual behavior within marriage. You're creeping through the shadows of a medieval castle at midnight, following the sound of whispered conversations and stolen kisses that represent the only authentic romantic passion in a world where official love was regulated, commodified, and stripped of all spontaneity. Here in the darkness, away from the watchful eyes of family members and religious authorities, you're discovering where medieval people actually experienced the kind of romantic love that poets wrote about, but society tried to prevent. Secret affairs flourished in medieval society precisely because official courtship was so restrictive and unsatisfying, creating underground networks of passionate relationships that existed parallel to the formal marriage arrangements imposed by families and institutions. You're witnessing a shadow world where people could finally express genuine romantic feelings without worrying about dowry negotiations, family politics, or religious restrictions. The risks of forbidden love were extraordinary in medieval society, potentially resulting in social ostracism, financial ruin, physical violence, or even death, depending on the social status of the people involved and the specific nature of their transgression. Your observing relationships, or simply being discovered, could destroy entire families and create enemies that would persist for generations. Medieval literature is filled with stories of tragic lovers who chose death rather than separation, and these tales reflected real social conditions where forbidden love often led to genuinely catastrophic consequences. You're learning about a world where romantic passion was literally dangerous, requiring courage and desperation that modern lovers can barely imagine. The church maintained elaborate systems for investigating and punishing adultery, fornication, and other forms of unauthorized sexual behavior, creating a surveillance network that made private romantic relationships extremely difficult to maintain. Church courts specialized in extracting confessions and testimony about intimate relationships, using religious authority to pry into the most personal aspects of people's lives. Convents and monasteries, ironically, often became settings for passionate love affairs, precisely because they brought together young people who had been forced into religious life against their will. You're witnessing institutions designed to eliminate romantic temptation that instead created concentrated environments where forbidden love could flourish in secret. Historians still argue whether secret medieval love affairs represented genuine romantic rebellion against oppressive social systems, or simply reflected the universal human tendency to pursue forbidden pleasures regardless of the consequences. The evidence suggests that while some affairs were motivated by deep emotional connections, others were simply expressions of sexual desire or reactions against restrictive social conditions. Medieval love letters and poetry provide glimpses into the emotional intensity of forbidden relationships, revealing language and expressions of passion that were completely absent from official courtship procedures. You're reading communications between lovers who used elaborate codes and metaphors to discuss their feelings while avoiding detection by suspicious families or religious authorities. The social double standard regarding forbidden love was particularly harsh for medieval women, who faced much more severe consequences than men for engaging in unauthorized romantic relationships. You're observing a system where men might face social disapproval or financial penalties for adultery, while women could be subjected to public humiliation, physical punishment, or even execution, depending on their social status and the specific circumstances of their transgression. One particularly fascinating aspect of medieval forbidden love was the development of elaborate communication systems that allowed secret lovers to maintain relationships across great distances and social barriers. You're learning about coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent religious texts, symbolic gifts that conveyed romantic meaning, and networks of trusted intermediaries who carried communications between lovers who couldn't meet openly. The concept of courtly love, remember that fantasy we discussed earlier, actually provided useful cover for some real forbidden relationships by creating a socially acceptable vocabulary for discussing passionate feelings. Lovers could express genuine emotions using the conventional language of courtly romance, hiding authentic relationships behind the acceptable facade of literary convention. Medieval forbidden love often involved people who were separated by insurmountable social barriers, marriages to other people, religious vows, class differences, or family feuds that made open relationships impossible. You're witnessing the emergence of romantic ideals about love conquering all obstacles, ideals that were born from the real experiences of people who risked everything for authentic emotional connections. You're standing in a medieval church court, watching desperate couples navigate the only legal escape routes available from marriages that had become unbearable, discovering that medieval divorce law was simultaneously more restrictive and more creative than anything modern legal systems have produced. The church officially didn't allow divorce, but it had developed an elaborate system of annulments, separations, and canonical loopholes that provided alternatives for couples determined to escape their marital obligations. The concept of annulment was based on the principle that some marriages had never been valid in the first place, allowing church courts to essentially declare that certain unions had never legally existed. You're learning about legal arguments based on technicalities like insufficient consent, undisclosed previous marriages, hidden blood relationships, or failure to meet canonical requirements that could retroactively invalidate years of married life. Medieval legal scholars developed incredibly sophisticated arguments for proving that marriages were invalid, creating a specialized field of canon law that focused on finding technical grounds for annulment. You're witnessing legal proceedings where lawyers argued about the precise meaning of consent, the validity of betrothal contracts, and the interpretation of religious requirements with the intensity of modern constitutional scholars. Most common grounds for medieval annulment were consanguinity, blood relationship, affinity, relationship through marriage, and non-consummation. But creative legal minds found ways to argue for annulment based on everything from spiritual incompatibility to undisclosed physical defects. Church courts maintained detailed records of successful annulment arguments, creating precedents that future couples could use as templates for their own escape attempts. Abandonment represented a more practical but legally problematic solution for unhappy medieval couples who couldn't afford the expense and complexity of formal annulment proceedings. You're observing a world where people simply disappeared from their marriages, sometimes relocating to distant regions where they could start new lives under assumed identities, leaving behind spouses who might never know what happened to them. Medieval society developed informal support networks for abandoned spouses, particularly women who found themselves suddenly responsible for supporting themselves and their children without any legal recognition of their changed circumstances. These communities understood that official legal remedies were often impractical or impossible, creating alternative systems of social support that operated outside formal institutions. Historians still argue whether medieval annulment and abandonment practices represented progressive alternatives to permanent marriage bonds, or simply reflected the inadequacy of medieval legal systems to address the realities of human relationships. The evidence suggests that while these escape routes provided relief for some desperate couples, they also created new forms of social and economic instability. The Church's attitude toward marriage dissolution was complicated by competing theological principles about the sanctity of marriage versus the importance of preventing sin and suffering. You're witnessing religious authorities who genuinely wanted to preserve marriage, while also recognizing that some unions created more spiritual harm than good, leading to inconsistent and sometimes contradictory legal decisions. Medieval annulment proceedings often required extensive testimony from witnesses who could provide evidence about the circumstances surrounding the original marriage ceremony, the couple's behavior during their relationship, and any factors that might invalidate the union. These legal processes could take years to complete and might involve testimony from dozens of people who had observed the couple's relationship. The economic implications of medieval marriage dissolution were staggering, particularly for women who might lose access to property, inheritance rights, and social support systems that had been based on their married status. You're learning about legal battles that continued for decades after annulments were granted, as families fought over property settlements and financial obligations that had been disrupted by the dissolution of marriages. One particularly creative aspect of medieval marriage law was the development of legal separations that allowed couples to live apart while remaining technically married, preserving the legal fiction of marriage while acknowledging that the relationship had become impossible to maintain. These arrangements satisfied church doctrine while providing practical relief for couples who couldn't coexist. You're sitting by a dying fire in a medieval castle, reflecting on how the elaborate courtship rituals, family negotiations, and religious restrictions you've witnessed still echo through modern romantic culture in ways that most people never recognize. The medieval obsession with controlling love through institutional authority has evolved into contemporary dating apps that promise to optimize romantic choices through algorithmic matching, while the fundamental tension between individual desire and social expectations remains essentially unchanged. The medieval practice of arranged marriages based on practical considerations has transformed into modern expectations that romantic partners should also serve as financial partners, career supporters, and lifestyle companions who enhance rather than complicate our practical lives. You're recognizing how the medieval integration of romance with economic calculation persists in contemporary discussions about partner compatibility, financial stability, and long-term practical suitability. Medieval courtly love ideals, those impossible fantasies of perfect devotion and eternal romantic suffering, have evolved into modern entertainment that still promotes unrealistic expectations about relationships while providing escapist alternatives to the mundane realities of actual romantic partnerships. The same gap between romantic fantasy and practical reality that frustrated medieval couples continues to shape contemporary dating culture. The Church's historical control over marriage and sexuality has been replaced by different forms of institutional authority, legal systems, social media platforms, and cultural expectations that continue to regulate and commodify romantic relationships in ways that medieval people would recognize and understand. You're observing how the fundamental human desire for authentic romantic connection continues to struggle against systems designed to control and profit from that desire. Medieval women's lack of romantic agency has evolved into contemporary debates about gender roles, relationship expectations, and the balance of power in romantic partnerships, while the basic questions about individual autonomy versus social stability remain unresolved. The medieval tension between personal happiness and family obligations has transformed but not disappeared, continuing to influence modern discussions about marriage, commitment, and individual fulfillment. Historians still argue whether human romantic behavior has fundamentally changed since medieval times, or whether we simply express the same basic emotional needs through different social mechanisms. But the evidence suggests remarkable continuity in both the desires that drive romantic relationships and the social forces that attempt to control them. The medieval development of romantic symbolism, gift-giving customs, and ceremonial expressions of love created cultural vocabulary that persists in contemporary courtship rituals, wedding ceremonies, and relationship milestones. You're recognizing how seemingly modern romantic gestures have roots in medieval attempts to formalize and celebrate emotional connections within restrictive social frameworks. Medieval legal innovations in marriage contracts, property rights, and relationship dissolution provided foundations for contemporary family law, divorce proceedings, and prenuptial agreements that continue to balance romantic idealism with practical legal protections. The same fundamental questions about commitment, property, and personal autonomy that challenged medieval legal scholars continue to evolve in modern courts and legislatures. The medieval integration of politics, economics, and romance in marriage arrangements has evolved into contemporary networking culture where professional relationships, social connections, and romantic partnerships intersect in ways that would seem familiar to medieval matchmakers who understood that all human relationships carry multiple layers of meaning and consequence. As you reflect on this journey through medieval courtship culture, you're beginning to understand that the fundamental challenges of balancing individual romantic desires with social expectations, practical necessities, and institutional requirements remain remarkably consistent across centuries of human experience. Now, as the medieval world slowly fades around you, let yourself drift back toward the present moment, carrying with you a deeper appreciation for the complexity and resilience of human romantic connection across the centuries. The castle walls are dissolving into the soft darkness of your own room, the voices of medieval lovers becoming whispers that merge with the gentle sounds of your own breathing. You're releasing the tension and drama of medieval courtship, allowing yourself to feel grateful for the romantic freedoms that modern life provides, while also recognizing the timeless human desires that connect you to every person who has ever fallen in love, made difficult choices about relationships, or struggled to balance personal happiness with social expectations and practical realities. Let your body settle more deeply into comfort, feeling the soft support of your bed, the gentle warmth of your blankets, the peaceful security of your own private space, where you can rest without worrying about family negotiations, religious restrictions, or social surveillance of your personal choices. You're safe in your own time, in your own life, with the freedom to pursue authentic romantic connections without the elaborate institutional barriers that complicated medieval love. The stories of medieval lovers, both the official courtships and the secret affairs, the arranged marriages and the forbidden passions, are settling into the quiet corners of your mind like old books returning to their shelves, their lessons absorbed, but their drama softened into the peaceful wisdom that comes from understanding how much human nature endures across time, while also appreciating how much our circumstances have improved. Sleep is approaching like a gentle tide, carrying away the last echoes of troubadour songs and church bells, leaving you floating in the timeless space between past and present, between story and dream, where all the lovers throughout history join together in the universal human experience of seeking connection, understanding, and the simple comfort of being known and cherished by another soul. Rest now, knowing that love has always found ways to flourish despite every obstacle that society, institutions, or circumstances have placed in its path, and that your own capacity for love connects you to an endless chain of human hearts that stretches back through all the centuries and forward into all the possibilities that tomorrow might bring.